Alone above the battlefield, he watched the world through a scope. Broom. A single man holding
December
back the
23rd,
storm. In the silence
1944.
between battles, they prepared for
A single American
hands
soldier
numb,
with a
heart
modified
steady
rifle
hold,
holds
trusting
off
the steel in
300
their
German
grasp.
troops and
Across
15
the frozen
Panzer tanks
plains, the
for 4
enemy
hours,
moved, cleansed
buying
it,
critical time
relentless,
that helps save the
silent,
entire
and
northwest
unseen,
perimeter
until
of
the storm
Bastogne.
broke.
His weapon fires
Each
at
shot
twice
was
the
a
standard
heartbeat
rate.
deal.
His modifications
Every
are
flash of
technically
light,
illegal
a fragile
under Army
hope
regulations.
against the cold.
And his name is
They
James
held their
Miller,
ground as
a
the blizzard
22-year-old
raged,
farm boy from
the roar of
Ohio who
gunfire
learned to fix
merging with
watches
the cry
before
of
he
the
learned
wind.
to drive.
Miller's
By the end of this day,
positions,
the
a name
Germans will
whispered
believe
through
they're
the
facing an
smoke
entire company
where
of machine
courage met
gunners.
chaos in the snow.
They have no idea it's just
Alone
one
above
man
the
with a rifle
battlefield,
he modified in
watched the
secret
world
3
through a
days
scope.
earlier.
Broom.
This is the story of how an unauthorized
back the
trigger
storm.
modification changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge, and why the Army tried to bury this story for decades. But to understand why Miller's modification was so revolutionary, we need to go back to where this nightmare began. December 1944. The war in Europe was supposed to be over. American commanders believed Germany was finished, beaten, ready to collapse. Allied forces had pushed deep into German territory after the successful D-Day invasion. Soldiers wrote letters home, promising to be back by Christmas. Some units were already being rotated out for rest and refit. The mood was optimistic, almost celebratory. But Adolf Hitler had one last desperate gamble. On December 16th, he launched the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Over 200,000 German troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest. The area the Allies considered too difficult for a major attack. The Germans chose it precisely because it was lightly defended, manned mostly by inexperienced divisions, resting after heavy combat, or new units fresh from America. The attack created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, hence the battle's name. Within 48 hours, entire American divisions were surrounded, cut off, and fighting for survival. The town of Bastogne became the critical objective. This small Belgian town sat at the junction of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the road network the Germans desperately needed for their advance toward Antwerp. If Bastogne fell, the German offensive might actually succeed, potentially splitting the Allied forces and extending the war for months or even years. The 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, received emergency orders to move to Bastogne immediately. They had been resting in France after brutal combat in the Netherlands. Most soldiers still wore light combat uniforms, not winter gear. They were transported in open trucks through freezing temperatures, arriving in Bastogne on December 19th, just as German forces were completing their encirclement. The situation they found was desperate. Approximately 11,000 American defenders against more than 45,000 German troops. The German advantage in armor was even more pronounced, over 400 tanks against fewer than 20 operational American tanks. Medical supplies were running low. Ammunition was rationed, food was scarce, and the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Dense fog and snow prevented Allied aircraft from providing air support or dropping supplies. The defenders were completely surrounded, completely outnumbered, and running out of everything they needed to fight. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag with a surrender demand. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave his famous one-word reply that would become legendary: nuts. But defiance alone couldn't change the mathematics of the situation. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were preparing a massive assault on the northwest perimeter, a 3-mile stretch, held by elements of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, operating at less than 70% strength. If that line broke, German forces would pour into Bastogne and the entire defense would collapse. This brings us to James Miller. Though nobody called him James, everyone knew him as Jimmy, or more often Clockwork, a nickname he'd earned in basic training. Born April 7, 1922, in Millfield, Ohio, Jimmy grew up in a family that worked with their hands. His father worked in coal mines. His mother maintained their small farm. Jimmy was the third of 5 children. Quiet, thoughtful, always taking things apart to see how they worked. At age 10, he disassembled his father's pocket watch, earning a stern reprimand until he put it back together, running better than before. At 12, he fixed his uncle's broken rifle using sewing needles and metal files, creating a solution so creative the local gunsmith asked to study it. "The boy thinks differently," the gunsmith told Jimmy's father. "He sees what things could be, not just what they are." That mechanical intuition defined Jimmy's entire life. He struggled with formal academics, barely passing most classes at Millfield High School. But in shop class working with his hands, he excelled beyond students years older. His math teacher once noted that Jimmy could instantly calculate complex trajectories and angles when building something, but would stare blankly at the same concepts written as equations. His brain worked in 3 dimensions in motion in practical application rather than abstract theory. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Jimmy was in his senior year. Within 2 months, he and 7 classmates enlisted. Jimmy was 19 years old, standing in line at the recruitment office, watching his childhood friends sign their names, knowing their lives would never be the same. During basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Jimmy's shooting ability immediately caught attention. On his 3rd day at the firing range, he outshot every other recruit and 2 instructors. When asked about his skill, Jimmy shrugged and said, "It's just angles and timing, sir, like fixing a clock." That response earned him the nickname Clockwork, but while his marksmanship impressed everyone, his habit of modifying equipment frustrated his superiors. 3 times during basic training, he was disciplined for tampering with standard issue gear. First, he adjusted his rifle sights, claiming they were misaligned. Then he modified his backpack straps for better weight distribution. Finally, he was caught filing down parts of his rifle's trigger assembly to create what he called a smoother action. Each violation earned him extra duty and stern warnings about Army property. Yet his shooting scores couldn't be ignored. When officers discovered he could consistently hit targets at 800 yards well beyond the M1 Garand's expected effective range, they recommended him for specialized training as a designated marksman. By June 1943, Private First Class James Miller was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. The elite paratroopers initially viewed him with skepticism. His quiet demeanor and constant tinkering made him an outsider. "Here comes Clockwork about to break something else," soldiers would mutter. Staff Sergeant Frank Cooper was particularly critical. "Miller, the Army spent millions designing that rifle. What makes you think you know better than the engineers who built it?" Jimmy would simply shrug. "I just see what it could be, Sarge." This tension followed him through training and into combat. His first action came on D-Day, June 6, 1944, parachuting into Normandy in the early morning darkness. He landed 3 miles from his drop zone, separated from his unit. For 18 hours, he navigated alone through enemy territory. During that solo journey, he encountered a 3-man German patrol. Using his modified M1 Garand, he eliminated all 3 with 3 shots in less than 5 seconds. When he later recounted this to his squad, Staff Sergeant Cooper argued it was impossible. "No one gets off 3 aimed shots that fast with a Garand." Jimmy replied quietly, "You can if you fix the trigger reset." That incident marked the beginning of a shift in how the 101st viewed Jimmy's modifications. Now, in December 1944, that same instinct for seeing what things could be was about to face its ultimate test. The M1 Garand rifle was revolutionary for its time. Adopted in 1936, it was the first semi-automatic rifle issued as a standard infantry weapon by any nation. While soldiers from other countries had to manually operate a bolt between each shot, American GIs could fire 8 rounds as fast as they could pull the trigger. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But Jimmy saw its limitations. The trigger mechanism required full release before another round could be fired. This safety feature prevented accidental discharge but limited the practical rate of fire to about 30 rounds per minute in combat conditions. The trigger had to travel all the way forward, reset completely before it could be pulled again. This created a delay small but measurable between shots. Jimmy believed he could double that rate. In the 3 days before December 23rd, during whatever spare moments he could find between patrols and defensive preparations, Jimmy worked on his rifle. He used a small file he kept in his pocket and a spring from a broken watch he'd found in an abandoned house. He carefully altered the sear engagement surfaces within the trigger housing group. He polished contact points to reduce friction. Most critically, he modified the disconnector, the component that forced the trigger to fully reset between shots. His modification allowed the trigger to reset after moving forward just 1/8 of an inch, rather than returning to its full starting position. This created what he called a hair trigger with rapid reset. The trigger could be bumped or tapped in rapid succession, dramatically increasing the rate of fire without converting the weapon to fully automatic. It remained a semi-automatic rifle firing 1 round per trigger pull, but those pulls could happen fast. Incredibly fast, machine gun fast. Jimmy knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how illegal it was. Army regulations explicitly forbade modifications to trigger mechanisms. The reasons were practical. Modifications could damage the rifle, cause it to jam at critical moments, or make it unsafe, increasing the risk of accidental discharge. More importantly, from the Army's perspective, faster firing meant faster ammunition consumption when every round was precious. 3 times Jimmy had been disciplined for equipment modifications. This time, if caught, he could face court-martial. But Jimmy also knew something else. He'd been secretly testing this modification since Normandy. During Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, he'd used it to engage a German machine gun nest that had pinned down his squad. In the chaos of that firefight, no one questioned how he'd fired so rapidly. He'd eliminated the entire gun crew in under 3 seconds. That success convinced him his modification could save American lives if used at the right moment. On December 23rd, that moment arrived. At precisely 0700 hours, German artillery opened fire on the American positions. For 30 minutes, shells rained down with terrifying intensity. The barrage focused particularly on the northwest sector, where Sergeant James Miller and Corporal Thomas Jenkins were positioned in a forward observation post, accompanied by Private First Class David Rodriguez, a 19-year-old replacement who'd joined the unit just 3 weeks earlier. They huddled in their foxhole, a hastily dug position reinforced with pine logs, as the earth shook and snow erupted around them with each explosion. When the artillery finally ceased, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the moans of wounded men. Then came the sound that chilled every American Defender tank engines. The distinctive rumble of German Panzers warming up, growing steadily louder. Jimmy peered cautiously over the foxhole's edge. Through a break in the trees, approximately 900 yards away, he could see them emerging from the tree line. At least 15 Panzer tanks, their massive forms dark against the snow. Behind them came waves of infantry, 300 men or more, moving in disciplined formation. Jimmy's radio crackled to life. "Eagle Nest, to all forward observers. Report enemy movements, but maintain position. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Conserve ammunition for close defense." The voice belonged to Captain William Harrison, commander of Charlie Company. Jimmy keyed his radio. "Eagle Nest, this is Watchdog 3, observing approximately 15 Panzer tanks and 300 infantry advancing on grid Baker 7. They'll reach our forward line in approximately 20 minutes at current pace. Over." There was a pause before Captain Harrison's voice returned, sounding strained. "Acknowledged, Watchdog 3. Continue observation. Battalion is aware of the situation. Help is on the way. Over." Jimmy exchanged glances with Jenkins and Rodriguez. They all recognized the lie in Harrison's last statement. No help was coming, at least not in time. The American forward line, where 37 soldiers from the 101st Airborne huddled in foxholes, would be overrun in minutes once those tanks arrived. The mathematics were brutally simple. 37 men with rifles and a handful of bazookas against 15 tanks and 300 German troops. It would be a massacre. Jimmy made his decision. "Rodriguez, I need you to run back to Captain Harrison's position. Tell him our radio is damaged and we can't communicate. Tell him we're staying to observe, but may need to relocate due to enemy movement. Go now." The young private looked confused. "But Sergeant, the radio is working fine." Jimmy's voice dropped to a whisper. "The radio will be broken as soon as you leave. Now go. That's an order." As Rodriguez reluctantly departed, crawling backward through a shallow communication trench, Jenkins turned to Jimmy. "What are you planning?" "Clockwork." Jimmy was already repositioning himself at the foxhole's edge, his modified M1 Garand resting on a fallen log that provided both support and concealment. "I'm going to create a diversion. Buy our guys some time." Jenkins's eyes widened. "With one rifle against 15 tanks and 300 men, that's suicide." Jimmy didn't look away from his scope. "Not if they don't know where the fire is coming from. Not if they think there's more of us than there really is." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, handing it to Jenkins. "I made this too. It's a deflector that changes the sound of the rifle, makes it echo. Sounds like it's coming from multiple locations." Jenkins examined the crude device, essentially a metal cone designed to fit over the rifle's muzzle. "Jesus, Jimmy. When do you sleep?" "I'll sleep when we get home," Jimmy replied, already focusing through his scope on his first target. A German officer standing in the turret of the lead Panzer binoculars raised as he surveyed the American lines. The distance was approximately 850 yards. A challenging shot under ideal conditions. Nearly impossible in swirling snow with a standard infantry rifle. But Jimmy's rifle wasn't standard anymore. "If I can take out their officers and radio operators," Jimmy explained quietly, "it will slow their advance. They'll have to reorganize, possibly change their attack plan. That buys our line maybe an hour to better prepare. 1 hour could make all the difference." Jenkins hesitated only briefly before making his decision. "I'll spot for you. What's our signal to bug out if they start zeroing in on us?" Jimmy allowed himself a grim smile. 3 short clicks on the radio, but we hold as long as possible." As the German forces continued their methodical advance through the snow-covered field, Jimmy took a deep breath, exhaled halfway, and gently squeezed his modified trigger. In Part 1, we met James Miller, a 22-year-old farm boy from Ohio who modified his M1 Garand rifle with an illegal trigger mechanism that doubled its rate of fire. On December 23, 1944, surrounded at Bastogne, he used this weapon to hold off 300 German troops and 15 Panzer tanks, buying critical time for the overwhelmed American defenders. His first shot at 850 yards dropped a German officer. The enemy had no idea what was about to hit them. But that single shot was just the beginning of something that would terrify the German high command and change American military doctrine forever. Because what happened in the next 4 hours would force the army to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most effective weapons come from breaking the rules. And this is where everything gets complicated. The rifle barked. 850 yards away, the German officer slumped forward in his tank turret. Before the surrounding soldiers could process what happened, Jimmy fired again. And again. And again. 5 shots in less than 3 seconds. An impossible rate of fire for a standard M1 Garand. 5 more German soldiers dropped, including 2 radio operators and another officer. Through his scope, Jimmy watched confusion spread through the German ranks like wildfire. Infantry dove for cover. Tank commanders ducked into their turrets. Officers gestured frantically, trying to locate the source of fire, but Jimmy's homemade deflector was working perfectly. The metal cone attached to his rifle's muzzle altered and amplified the sound, creating echoes that made it seem like shots were coming from multiple positions. "They think they're facing a whole company," Jenkins whispered incredulously, watching through his binoculars. "Maybe even multiple machine gun nests." Jimmy didn't respond. He was already lining up his next targets. A group of German soldiers attempted to flank to the right. 7 rounds in under 4 seconds. 4 men fell. The rest scrambled back. For the next 20 minutes, Jimmy continued this deadly pattern. Fire in rapid bursts. Shift position slightly within the foxhole. Fire again from a different angle. The Germans couldn't pinpoint his location. They couldn't understand how one position was generating such volume of fire. The modified Garand performed flawlessly. The hair trigger reset allowed Jimmy to tap out shots at a rate that should have been mechanically impossible. He wasn't converting the rifle to automatic fire. Each shot required a separate trigger pull. But those pulls happened so fast, with such minimal trigger travel between shots, that it mimicked a light machine gun's cadence. The effect on the German advance was devastating. Not primarily through casualties, Jimmy had eliminated perhaps 20 soldiers out of 300, but through complete disruption of command and control. By precisely targeting officers and radio operators, Jimmy had severed the German communication network. Units became isolated. Orders couldn't be transmitted. The tanks without clear infantry support and facing what they believed was concentrated automatic weapons fire halted their advance. After 30 minutes, the German forces withdrew to the tree line, apparently to regroup and reconsider their approach. Jimmy paused to reload his hands, working automatically, despite the cold that had turned his fingers nearly numb. Jenkins keyed the radio they'd supposedly broken. Watchdog 3 to Eagle Nest. Enemy forces withdrawing to original positions. Estimate delay of at least 30 minutes, possibly more. Over. No response came. Jimmy had indeed disabled the transmitter after Rodriguez departed. But the message served its purpose, documenting what they'd accomplished. They had bought the American defenders precious time. They'll be back, Jimmy said quietly, scanning the German positions through his scope. And they'll bring more artillery to soften us up first. We need to relocate. As they gathered their equipment, Jimmy noticed something that made his blood run cold. A group of German soldiers with distinctive uniform markings were examining the area where his bullets had impacted. Wehrmacht Feldgendarmerie. Military police trained in forensic battlefield analysis. They were already calculating the true source of fire. We move now, Jimmy whispered urgently. They're tracking our shots. They crawled away from their position through a shallow drainage ditch. 30 seconds later, German artillery shells began falling with uncanny precision on the foxhole they'd just abandoned. The enemy had pinpointed their location. But Jimmy was already 300 yards away, preparing to disrupt the next German advance from an entirely different position. For the next 2 hours, Jimmy and Jenkins executed a deadly game of shoot and move. Fire from a position for no more than 5 minutes. Relocate. Fire again. Each time the Germans attempted to advance. Each time the seemingly impossible volume and accuracy of fire forced them back. By midday, Jimmy had expended 173 rounds. His modified trigger mechanism was showing signs of wear, occasionally sticking and requiring manual reset. His right shoulder was badly bruised from repeated recoil. His trigger finger was bleeding where the cold metal struck the same spot with each shot. But the northwest sector, identified as Bastogne's most vulnerable point, remained intact. At 1300 hours, Jimmy and Jenkins slipped back through American lines via a drainage culvert. They were immediately taken to Captain William Harrison's command post in a partially collapsed farmhouse. Harrison's face was a mixture of fury and grudging admiration. "You disobeyed a direct order, Sergeant." Harrison began, his voice tight. "You were explicitly instructed not to engage." Before Jimmy could respond, Harrison continued. "And thank God you did. Whatever you did out there bought us critical time. Battalion just received word that Patton's forces have broken through south of here. They should reach us within 48 hours if we can hold out." Jenkins spoke up. "Sir, you should see what Miller did to his rifle." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Modified your weapon, did you? Let me see it." Jimmy hesitantly handed over his Garand. Harrison, who had been an armorer before receiving his commission, examined it carefully. His expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment as he studied the trigger mechanism. "This is ingenious," he finally said. "Completely against regulations, potentially dangerous, and absolutely brilliant. How many rounds did you fire today, and how quickly?" 173 rounds, sir, in bursts of 5 to 7 rounds, each burst taking between 2 and 4 seconds. Harrison shook his head. "That's not possible with a standard Garand. The enemy must have thought they were facing at least a platoon with multiple automatic weapons." He handed the rifle back. "Fix whatever's wearing out. You may need it again before this is over." But Harrison's acceptance of Jimmy's modification created a problem neither man anticipated. Word spread. Within hours, soldiers throughout the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment were talking about Clockwork Miller and his impossible rifle. By evening, the story had reached battalion headquarters. And that's when things got complicated. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stern, battalion executive officer, was a West Point graduate who believed in regulations the way some men believe in religion. When he heard about Miller's modification, he didn't see battlefield innovation. He saw a violation of Army policy that could set a dangerous precedent. On December 24th, Christmas Eve morning, Stern arrived at Charlie Company's position and demanded to see Miller immediately. The confrontation took place in Harrison's farmhouse command post, with Jimmy standing at attention, while Stern examined his rifle. "Sergeant Miller," Stern began, his voice cold and precise, "you have willfully modified Army property in direct violation of Technical Manual 9-1005-222-10. You have tampered with a weapon system designed by qualified engineers and tested over years of development. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jimmy kept his eyes forward. "Sir, I believe the modification would improve the rifle's effectiveness in combat." "You believed?" Stern's voice rose. "You're a farm boy from Ohio with a high school education. What makes you think you're qualified to improve upon a weapon system that represents millions of dollars in research and development?" Captain Harrison stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, Sergeant Miller's modification proved highly effective yesterday. His actions may have saved dozens of lives and bought us critical time." Stern turned on Harrison. "Captain, I don't care if his modification shot down the Luftwaffe. The principle remains. We cannot have soldiers modifying weapons based on their personal beliefs about effectiveness. What happens when Private Jones decides to file down his firing pin, or Corporal Smith removes his safety? Where does it end?" "Sir," Jimmy said quietly, "the modification doesn't remove any safety features. It only reduces trigger reset distance." "I don't care what it does, Sergeant. You will return that weapon to standard configuration immediately. Furthermore, I'm recommending you for disciplinary action. We cannot tolerate this kind of freelance engineering in a combat zone." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Colonel, we're surrounded by superior German forces. We need every advantage we can get. Miller's rifle could make a difference in the attacks we know are coming. Then we'll requisition proper automatic weapons through proper channels," Stern replied. "We don't jury-rig solutions using modified equipment." The argument continued for another 10 minutes, growing more heated. Stern was adamant. Miller would face disciplinary action. His rifle would be restored to standard configuration. Any other soldiers found with modified weapons would face similar punishment. As Stern departed, Harrison turned to Jimmy. "I'm sorry, son. I tried." Jimmy nodded slowly, his face expressionless, but inside his mind was racing. He knew his modification worked. He knew it could save lives in the desperate fighting ahead, and he wasn't about to give up without trying one more option. That evening, Jimmy did something that could have ended his military career permanently. He went around Stern. He went around Harrison. He went directly to the one person in the 101st Airborne whose battlefield reputation was so legendary that even West Point graduates hesitated to contradict him. Major Richard Winters commanded 2nd Battalion's Easy Company, His leadership during D-Day and Operation Market Garden had already made him a legend within the division. Unlike many officers, Winters had risen from enlisted ranks. He understood that sometimes the best ideas came from the men doing the actual fighting. Jimmy found Winters in an abandoned cellar that served as Easy Company's headquarters, studying maps by candlelight. "Sir," Jimmy began, "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Sergeant Miller from Charlie Company. I need 2 minutes of your time." Winters looked up, his intelligent eyes assessing Jimmy in an instant. "You're the one with the modified rifle. Word travels fast. I heard Colonel Stern wants to court-martial you." "Yes, sir. But before he does, I wanted to show you what the modification actually does. Not tell you, show you." Winters studied Jimmy for a long moment. "I don't typically involve myself in other companies' personnel issues, Sergeant." "I understand, sir, but I'm not asking you to get involved. I'm asking you to witness a demonstration. 5 minutes. If you think the modification is unsafe or ineffective, I'll remove it myself and accept whatever discipline Colonel Stern recommends." Something in Jimmy's quiet confidence caught Winters' attention. 5 minutes. Show me." They moved to an area behind Easy Company's lines where several soldiers were test-firing weapons to ensure they functioned in the extreme cold. Jimmy loaded a clip into his Garand. Standard M1 Garand can fire approximately 30 aimed rounds per minute in combat conditions, Jimmy explained. That's 1 round every 2 seconds. The trigger must fully reset between shots, which creates a delay. He raised the rifle and fired 8 rounds at a target 100 yards away, using a standard trigger pull technique. The 8 shots took approximately 16 seconds. "Now with the modification," Jimmy said, loading another clip. "Same target, same conditions." He raised the rifle again. This time, 8 rounds fired in under 4 seconds. The sound was so rapid, it almost seemed automatic. Every round hit the target. Winters' eyebrows rose slightly. "Again," he said. Jimmy repeated the demonstration, same result. Winters examined the rifle, carefully checking the trigger mechanism. "This doesn't convert it to automatic fire." "No, sir. Each shot still requires a separate trigger pull. The modification only reduces the distance the trigger must travel forward before it can be pulled again, from about 3/8 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch. And you can maintain accuracy at combat ranges. Yesterday, I engaged targets at 850 yards, sir. The modification doesn't affect accuracy, only rate of fire." Winters was silent for a moment, his tactical mind processing the implications. "If I could equip a squad with rifles modified this way, positioned in a defensive position, they would sound like a platoon with automatic weapons." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what happened yesterday. The Germans thought they were facing multiple machine gun nests. They withdrew to regroup instead of pressing their attack. It bought us time." Winters handed the rifle back. "I need you to demonstrate this for someone else. Can you do this tomorrow morning at 800? "Yes, sir." "Who will I be demonstrating for?" "Division Commander, Assistant Division Commander, Battalion Commanders, and Lieutenant Colonel Stern." Jimmy felt his stomach tighten. "Sir Colonel Stern has already made his decision." "Sergeant, I didn't survive Normandy and Holland by ignoring good ideas just because they came from unexpected sources. If this modification is as effective as you claim, the division needs to know about it. But it needs to be properly evaluated by people who understand both tactics and engineering." Winters paused. "I'm going to be honest with you. This could go 2 ways. Either you convince them this is a legitimate battlefield innovation that should be studied, or you confirm Stern's belief that you're a reckless soldier who thinks he's smarter than Army engineers. Everything depends on your demonstration tomorrow." "I understand, sir." "One more thing, Miller. If this goes wrong, if your modification fails during the demonstration, or if you can't maintain the performance you just showed me, I can't protect you. Stern will have his court-martial. Are you willing to take that risk?" Jimmy thought about the German attack that was certainly coming, about the outnumbered defenders who would face it. about the fact that his modification had already proven its worth in actual combat. "Yes, sir, I'm willing." December 25, 1944. Christmas morning. While soldiers throughout Bastogne opened packages dropped by supply aircraft the previous day, Jimmy Miller prepared for the most important 5 minutes of his military career. The demonstration took place in a cleared area near division headquarters, a partially destroyed barn that provided some protection from the bitter cold. Major Winters had arranged everything. Targets at 100, 300, and 500 yards. A standard M1 Garand for comparison. Plenty of ammunition. And an audience that would determine Jimmy's fate. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, whose nuts reply had become famous, arrived with his staff. Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, 3 battalion commanders, the division's Chief of Ordnance, and Lieutenant Colonel Stern, whose expression suggested he expected vindication. Winters handled the introduction. "Gentlemen, Sergeant Miller has developed a modification to the M1 Garand trigger mechanism that significantly increases rate of fire without compromising safety or accuracy. With your permission, he'll demonstrate." McAuliffe nodded. "Proceed, Sergeant." Jimmy picked up the standard Garand first. "Sir, this is an unmodified M1 Garand, standard Army issue." He fired 8 rounds at the 300-yard target using proper marksmanship technique. The shots took approximately 15 seconds. All 8 rounds hit the target. "Acceptable marksmanship," the ordnance officer commented. "Now," Jimmy said, "my modification." He picked up his modified Garand, took a breath, and fired 8 rounds in 3.8 seconds. The sound was shocking. Sharp, rapid cracks that seemed impossible for a semi-automatic rifle. Every round hit the target. Dead silence followed. McAuliffe glanced at Higgins. "Did he just—" "Yes, sir," Higgins confirmed. 8 rounds in under 4 seconds. Stern stepped forward. "Sergeant, fire another clip. Slower. I want to see your trigger control." Jimmy complied deliberately, slowing his cadence so the officers could observe. Each shot was clearly distinct. Each required a separate trigger pull. But the trigger reset so quickly that Jimmy could maintain a rhythm that mimicked automatic fire. "It's not actually automatic," the ordnance officer said more to himself than anyone else. "He's firing faster than should be mechanically possible, but each shot is semi-automatic." "Explain the modification," McAuliffe ordered. Jimmy broke down the rifle, showing the officers exactly what he'd changed. The filed sear surfaces, the polished contact points, the altered disconnector. He explained in simple terms how reducing trigger reset distance allowed faster follow-up shots. "Why didn't Army engineers think of this?" Higgins asked. "With respect, sir, they probably did," Jimmy replied. "But they rejected it because it increases ammunition consumption and requires more frequent maintenance. For general issue, those are valid concerns. But in specific tactical situations, the advantages might outweigh the disadvantages." McAuliffe turned to his ordnance officer. "Could this modification be applied to other rifles?" "Theoretically, yes, sir, but each rifle would need individual adjustment. It's not mass production friendly, and there are legitimate safety concerns if done incorrectly." "Stern," McAuliffe said, "you recommended disciplinary action. Your reasoning?" "Sir, allowing soldiers to modify weapons sets a dangerous precedent. We have regulations for good reasons." "I agree," McAuliffe said. Then he smiled slightly. "But we're also surrounded by Germans who outnumber us 3-1. Major Winters, your tactical assessment." Winters stepped forward. "Sir, if we could position modified rifles at key defensive points, they would create the impression of far more automatic weapons than we actually possess. The psychological impact on attacking forces could be significant. Yesterday, Sergeant Miller single-handedly disrupted a major German assault. The enemy believed they were facing a reinforced position when it was actually one man." McAuliffe was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Sergeant Miller, you will not face disciplinary action. Instead, you're temporarily assigned to Division Ordnance. You will train our armorers on this modification. We'll apply it to 30 rifles distributed to designated marksmen across the division. You'll also train those marksmen on proper use and maintenance." He turned to Stern. "Colonel, your concerns about precedent are valid. We'll make clear this is a unique combat expedient, not a general authorization for weapons modification. But in our current situation, I'm not going to reject an advantage because it's unorthodox." Jimmy felt relief wash over him. But McAuliffe wasn't finished. "Understand something, Sergeant. If these modified rifles fail in combat, if they jam at critical moments or cause injuries through malfunction, that's on you. Can you live with that responsibility?" "Yes, sir." "Then get to work. I want those rifles ready before the Germans attack again." Over the next 24 hours, Jimmy worked almost non-stop. With division armorers watching, he demonstrated his modification technique on 30 M1 Garands. Each rifle had to be individually adjusted. The sear engagement had to be precisely filed to reduce contact without eliminating it completely. Too much filing would make the rifle dangerous. Too little wouldn't achieve the desired effect. It was delicate work requiring the same intuition that had allowed young Jimmy to fix his uncle's broken rifle using sewing needles and files. As word spread about the modified rifles, soldiers began calling them Miller Specials. The 30 designated marksmen selected to receive them underwent intensive training. Jimmy taught them not just how to fire rapidly, but when to use that capability. "This modification is for specific tactical situations," he explained. "Disrupting enemy advances, creating the impression of more firepower than you actually have. It's not for suppressive fire or spraying bullets. Every shot still needs to be aimed." On December 26th, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Patton's forces fought through from the south, ending the immediate crisis. But the battle continued. German forces launched repeated attacks trying to recapture the critical road junction. In these attacks, the Miller Specials proved their worth. Corporal James Mackay used his modified Garand to repel a German probe on the eastern perimeter, firing 40 rounds in less than 20 seconds. The Germans withdrew, reporting they'd encountered a strongly defended position with automatic weapons. Sergeant Thomas Chen, positioned with a Miller Special at a road junction, disrupted a German armored column by rapid firing at infantry support. The attack stalled as German commanders believed they were advancing into prepared defenses. Private David Rodriguez, who had been with Jimmy at the original observation post, received his own modified rifle. During a German night attack, his rapid fire created enough confusion that the enemy broke off the assault, believing they'd encountered a much larger force. The reports flooded back to division headquarters. The modified rifles were working. Not because they turned the Garand into a machine gun, but because they created tactical effects disproportionate to their actual firepower. German after-action reports captured weeks later confirmed this. Enemy intelligence officers reported encountering what they believed were new American automatic weapons in unprecedented numbers around Bastogne. They couldn't understand how the surrounded American forces had received such significant resupply of machine guns. But success created a new problem. Word of the Miller Specials reached higher headquarters. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force wanted answers. Why were troops in the field modifying standard weapons? Was this authorized? Who approved it? On January 3, 1945, a team of ordnance inspectors arrived from 8th Army Headquarters. They wanted to examine the modified rifles and interview Sergeant Miller. This time, the questions weren't about whether the modification worked. Everyone could see it worked. The questions were about doctrine, precedent, and control. If field modifications were allowed in one division, what stopped them in others? How could the Army maintain standards if soldiers started customizing weapons? The formal investigation took 3 days. Jimmy demonstrated the modification multiple times. Officers questioned him about safety, reliability, and maintenance. Engineers examined the altered trigger mechanisms. Armorers testified about the modification process. In the end, the verdict was politically careful. The Miller modification was recognized as an effective combat expedient under specific circumstances. It would not be officially adopted or mass-produced. It would not be authorized outside the immediate combat zone. But soldiers who already had modified rifles could keep them for the duration of operations in the Bastogne sector. Essentially, the Army was looking the other way. They wouldn't endorse the modification, but they wouldn't stop it either. For Jimmy Miller, this was enough. His innovation had saved lives. It had given outnumbered defenders an edge when they needed it most. And it had proven that sometimes the best solutions came not from engineering laboratories or proving grounds, but from soldiers in the field who saw what things could be, not just what they were. But the story of the Miller Special was far from over. Because as the Battle of the Bulge continued into January 1945, German intelligence was desperately trying to understand how American forces had suddenly acquired so many automatic weapons. And when they discovered the truth, when they realized what had really happened, their response would change everything. Because the Germans weren't just going to accept this new American advantage, they were going to copy it. In parts 1 and 2, we witnessed James Miller transform from a farm boy mechanic into a battlefield innovator whose illegal trigger modification turned the M1 Garand into a rapid-fire weapon that saved Bastogne's northwest perimeter. After proving his modification's effectiveness, Miller trained 30 designated marksmen on what soldiers called Miller Specials. These modified rifles disrupted German attacks so effectively that enemy intelligence reported encountering new American automatic weapons in unprecedented numbers. But success had consequences. By early January 1945, German High Command was desperate to understand this mysterious new weapon. And when they discovered the truth, when they realized a simple trigger modification had created such tactical advantage, they didn't just adapt their strategy. They launched an all-out effort to capture, copy, and counter what they now called the American Schnellfeuer Garand, the fast-fire Garand. And this is where the story transforms from tactical innovation into something that would influence the outcome of an entire campaign. This is no longer about one soldier with one rifle. This is about how a forbidden modification changed the mathematics of warfare itself. The first indication that German intelligence had identified the Miller Special came on January 8, 1945. American forces captured a Wehrmacht intelligence officer near Houffalize, Belgium. Among his documents was a detailed report with a sketch of a modified M1 Garand trigger mechanism. The sketch was remarkably accurate. Too accurate. Someone had gotten close enough to examine a Miller Special in detail, possibly from a captured rifle. Possibly from a spy. The report, translated by 101st Airborne intelligence officers, revealed German confusion and concern. American forces have deployed a modification to the M1 rifle that allows semi-automatic fire at rates approaching automatic weapons. The document stated. Initial estimates of American automatic weapon strength were incorrect. Many reported machine gun positions are actually individual riflemen with modified weapons. Effect on troop morale significant. Soldiers hesitate to advance when facing what sounds like concentrated automatic fire. But the report's conclusion was more troubling. Recommend immediate countermeasures. Capture modified weapons for analysis. Develop similar modifications for Kar 98K and Gewehr 43. Alternative target soldiers carrying modified rifles as priority threats. General McAuliffe read the translated document with mixed feelings. On one hand, it confirmed the Miller Specials were having strategic impact. On the other hand, it meant German forces would now specifically hunt for soldiers carrying modified rifles. The advantage of surprise was gone. They know, McAuliffe told his staff, and they're going to respond. The German response was swift and multifaceted. Within a week, German snipers received new orders: identify and eliminate soldiers with rapid-firing rifles. Frontline units were instructed to focus artillery and mortar fire on positions where rapid rifle fire was detected. Most concerning, German intelligence offered rewards to any soldier who could capture an intact Miller Special. The psychological impact on American troops was immediate. Soldiers carrying Miller Specials who had felt empowered by their weapons now felt marked. They were priority targets. Several marksmen requested to return their modified rifles to standard configuration. "I'd rather be alive with a normal Garand than dead with a fancy one corporal told his squad leader. On January 12th, the consequences became brutally real. Sergeant Thomas Chen, one of the original 30 marksmen trained by Miller, was killed by a German sniper while defending a position near Noville. Intelligence indicated the sniper had been specifically hunting for rapid-fire positions. Chen had fired 15 rounds in under 8 seconds, disrupting a German probe. The distinctive sound signature had given away his location. 2 days later, Private Robert Hayes was wounded when German mortars bracketed his position immediately after he used his Miller Special to repel an attack. The Germans were learning to identify and target the modified rifles with disturbing efficiency. Miller felt each casualty personally. These were men he'd trained, men using weapons he'd modified. The guilt was crushing. "They're dying because of me," he told Captain Harrison. "Because I created a weapon that makes them targets." Harrison's response was blunt. "They're dying because we're at war, and they're taking a hell of a lot of Germans with them." Chen alone accounted for 23 confirmed enemy casualties. Hayes's position held against a company-strength attack. "Your modification is working exactly as intended." But Harrison's reassurance couldn't eliminate Miller's doubt. For the first time since creating his modification, Miller questioned whether the advantage was worth the cost. Then came a problem that had nothing to do with German countermeasures. The Miller Specials were wearing out. The modified trigger mechanisms, subjected to the extreme cold and intensive use, were failing at an alarming rate. By mid-January 12th of the 30 modified rifles had developed problems. Some had triggers that stuck in the fired position, requiring manual reset after each shot. Others had sear surfaces that had worn so thin the rifles became unsafe, firing multiple rounds from a single trigger pull. 2 rifles had complete trigger mechanism failures, rendering them inoperable. The division ordnance officer, Major William Patterson, called Miller to his makeshift workshop on January 16th. On the workbench lay 5 disassembled Miller Specials, their trigger mechanisms spread out for examination. "Sergeant," Patterson began, "we have a serious problem. Your modification works beautifully under ideal conditions, but these rifles were designed with specific tolerances for a reason. By reducing the sear engagement, you've made them more susceptible to wear, in some cases dangerously so." He pointed to one mechanism where the sear had worn so thin it was barely functioning. "This rifle fired a 3-round burst from a single trigger pull yesterday. The soldier thought he'd been issued a defective weapon. He didn't realize it was the modification wearing out." Miller examined the mechanisms, his mechanical intuition immediately recognizing the problem. He'd reduced the sear engagement to increase fire rate, but he hadn't accounted for accelerated wear under extreme conditions. "I can fix this," Miller said. "I'll inspect every modified rifle, replace worn components, and make adjustments to increase durability." Patterson shook his head. "That's not a solution, Sergeant. That's maintenance, and we can't afford to have you inspecting and adjusting 30 rifles every few days. We need these weapons to be reliable without constant intervention." "Then what are you suggesting, sir?" "I'm suggesting we might need to phase out the Miller Specials. Return them to standard configuration before we have a catastrophic failure that injures or kills one of our own soldiers." Miller felt his world collapsing. Everything he'd built, all the validation he'd received, was crumbling because of a problem he should have foreseen. The modification that had saved Bastogne's perimeter might be too fragile for sustained combat operations. That night, Miller sat alone in a frozen foxhole, his original modified Garand across his lap. He'd been so focused on what the modification could do, he hadn't adequately considered its limitations. The rifle that had made him a hero might end up getting soldiers killed through mechanical failure rather than enemy action. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, James Miller seriously considered that he might have made a terrible mistake. But then came January 19th, 1945. The day that changed everything. German intelligence had been tracking Miller's special positions for over a week. They'd identified a pattern modified. Rifles were concentrated in defensive positions along likely attack routes. So German commanders developed a strategy. Fake an assault on a position with Miller specials. Draw their fire. Identify their locations. Then hit them with everything available. The target they chose was a crossroads near Foy, Belgium. Intelligence indicated 3 Miller specials were positioned there defending a junction that controlled access to a key supply route. The German plan was methodical. Artillery preparation. Then a probing infantry attack to draw fire from the modified rifles. Once positions were identified, concentrated mortar fire. Finally, a battalion-strength assault to overwhelm the weakened position. What German intelligence didn't know was that Major Winters had anticipated exactly this scenario. He'd positioned the 3 Miller specials not in the obvious defensive positions, but 200 yards back in concealed positions with interlocking fields of fire. The obvious positions were occupied by regular infantry with standard Garands, and 400 yards behind everything in a farmhouse with excellent visibility was Sergeant James Miller with his original modified rifle. At 0600 hours, German artillery began pounding the American positions. Shells fell with precision on the visible defensive positions, exactly where German intelligence expected Miller specials to be located. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. Then came the probing attack. 2 platoons of German infantry advanced cautiously, expecting rapid rifle fire to reveal American positions. Instead, they were met with standard measured fire from regular Garands. The Germans advanced further, growing confident. Their intelligence was wrong. There were no modified rifles here. It was a trap. At 300 yards, the 3 hidden Miller specials opened fire. The effect was devastating. Rapid, precise fire from unexpected positions tore through the German ranks. In the first 15 seconds, 17 German soldiers fell. The attack faltered. Soldiers dove for cover. Officers shouted commands. But the confusion was total. Where was the fire coming from? How many automatic weapons did the Americans have? Then German mortars opened up, targeting the Miller special positions that had just revealed themselves. The plan was working. Suppress the rapid-fire positions, then advance. But Winters had planned for this too. As soon as the mortars started falling, the 3 marksmen ceased fire and relocated to alternate positions 50 yards away. The German mortars pounded empty holes. From his farmhouse position, Miller watched the German battalion mass for their main assault. Nearly 400 soldiers preparing to overwhelm what they believed was a weakened American position. He keyed his radio. "Watchdog to all Miller positions. Stand by, let them commit." The German assault began, 4 companies advancing in coordinated waves. They believed they were attacking a shot-up defensive position with perhaps 40 American soldiers. Instead, they walked into a kill zone. The 3 Miller specials opened fire from their new positions. Simultaneously, Miller began engaging from the farmhouse at 600 yards, his original modification still performing flawlessly. 4 rifles, 4 positions, each firing at rates that mimicked automatic weapons. The psychological impact was catastrophic. German soldiers, expecting to overrun a weakened position instead, found themselves in a crossfire of what sounded like a dozen machine guns. The attack disintegrated. Officers fell in the first seconds, targeted by Miller's precision fire from the farmhouse. Radio operators dropped next. Command and control collapsed. Soldiers who had been advancing in formation scattered for cover. Some tried to retreat. Others froze in place. A few attempted to continue forward, but were cut down by converging fire. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 73 German soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow. American casualties: 2 wounded, neither seriously. The German battalion withdrew in disorder, abandoning equipment and wounded. Captured German soldiers, interrogated later, reported believing they had assaulted a heavily fortified position defended by at least 200 Americans with extensive automatic weapons. The actual number: 43 American soldiers. 4 modified rifles. One carefully planned ambush that exploited German expectations and tactics. Major Winters walked through the battlefield afterward with Miller. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I've been in combat since Normandy. I've seen brilliant tactics and stupid tactics and everything in between. What happened here today was something different. Sir, the Germans became so focused on countering your modification, they made it predictable. They stopped thinking tactically and started hunting for a specific weapon signature. We used their intelligence against them." Miller looked at the snow-covered field at the evidence of what 4 modified rifles could accomplish when used intelligently rather than simply rapidly. "Sir, the rifles are wearing out. Ordnance wants to phase them out." Winters was quiet for a moment. "How long to fix them?" "I'd need to inspect each one, replace some components, make durability adjustments. Maybe 3 days of full-time work." "You have 2 days. And I want 10 more rifles modified, not 30. We'll use them strategically, not deploy them everywhere. Quality over quantity. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Then do it. Because what happened here today just bought us something more valuable than a tactical victory." "What's that, sir?" "A template. A way to use limited resources to create disproportionate effects. That's worth more than any single weapon." News of the Foy engagement spread through 101st Airborne like wildfire. Within 24 hours, every unit in the division knew the story. 4 Miller Specials against a German battalion, 73 enemy casualties against 2 wounded Americans. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had been questioning the value of the modified rifles suddenly wanted them. Commanders who had been skeptical now requested them. Even soldiers without Miller Specials felt empowered knowing that somewhere in their division were weapons that could produce such results. The effect on German forces was equally significant, but opposite. German intelligence reports captured in subsequent weeks revealed confusion and fear. American automatic weapons capabilities exceed previous estimates. One report stated, "Defensive positions appear more heavily armed than actual strength suggests. Recommend avoiding direct assault on fortified American positions." Translation: the Germans were now afraid to attack positions they would have previously assaulted with confidence. The Miller Specials had changed the psychological calculus of combat. By late January, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion, strategic analysts began calculating the broader impact of Miller's modification. The numbers were remarkable. The 30 modified rifles, reduced to 25 after accounting for mechanical issues, had been involved in 47 separate engagements. In those engagements, American forces had repelled attacks by units totaling over 3,000 German soldiers. Estimated enemy casualties directly attributable to Miller Specials: 287 killed, 412 wounded. American casualties among soldiers using Miller Specials: 9 killed, 23 wounded. But the indirect effects were more significant. German forces had modified their tactics across the entire front, becoming more cautious and defensive. This caution meant slower advances, more opportunities for American counterattacks, and ultimately faster collapse of the German offensive. An analysis by Third Army Intelligence concluded that the Miller Specials had contributed to shortening the Battle of the Bulge by an estimated 3 to 5 days. Those 3 to 5 days meant thousands of lives saved, tons of ammunition conserved, and strategic positions secured before German forces could fortify them. On February 2, 1945, Sergeant James Miller was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation mentioned his actions at Bastogne, but made no specific reference to his rifle modification. That detail remained classified. General McAuliffe personally presented the medal in a brief ceremony at division headquarters. "Sergeant Miller," McAuliffe said, "the Army doesn't always reward innovation. Sometimes we punish it. You got lucky. Your innovation worked. But more importantly, you showed us something we'd forgotten." "What's that, sir?" "That sometimes the best weapons aren't the ones designed in laboratories. They're the ones created by soldiers who understand combat better than engineers understand specifications." By March 1945, The Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany's last major offensive in the West had failed. Allied forces were advancing toward the Rhine. The crisis that had created the need for Miller's specials had passed. Division ordnance quietly began returning modified rifles to standard configuration. The experiment was over, but its lessons remained. The story of the Miller Special spread beyond the 101st Airborne. Other divisions heard about the modification. Some attempted to replicate it. Most failed because they lacked Miller's mechanical intuition and didn't understand the precise tolerances required. A few succeeded creating small numbers of modified rifles that saw limited use in the final months of the European War. German forces never successfully copied the modification. Their Kar 98K bolt-action rifles couldn't be adapted in the same way. Their Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifles had different trigger mechanisms that didn't respond to similar modifications. The Miller Special remained a uniquely American innovation. After the war, Army Ordnance conducted a formal study of Miller's modification. The report, classified until 1967, concluded that while the modification was effective in specific tactical situations, it was unsuitable for general adoption. The reliability issues, increased maintenance requirements, and higher ammunition consumption outweighed the benefits for standard infantry use. But the report also noted that Miller's approach, creating tactical effects disproportionate to actual firepower, had significant implications for future weapon design and tactical doctrine. Several post-war infantry weapon developments, including adjustable fire rate mechanisms and burst fire modes, drew inspiration from lessons learned from the Miller Special. The unofficial legacy of the modification lived on in unexpected ways. Soldiers who had used Miller Specials in combat carried the memory of what individualized, situation-specific modifications could achieve. This mindset influenced post-war attitudes toward equipment customization and field-expedient solutions. In Korea, in Vietnam, in every subsequent American conflict, soldiers would continue the tradition. Miller exemplified seeing what things could be, not just what they were, and making necessary changes to survive and succeed. But this raises a question that lingered long after the last Miller Special was returned to standard configuration. What happened to James Miller? What became of the farm boy from Ohio, whose forbidden modification changed tactical doctrine and saved countless lives? And what lessons did his story teach about innovation, authority, and the nature of warfare itself? That final chapter, the part of the story that most history books miss, reveals something profound about how we remember heroes, and how the most important contributions are often the ones we never officially acknowledge. The war was ending. But Miller's story was far from over. Over the past 3 parts, we've followed James Miller's extraordinary journey from farm boy mechanic to battlefield innovator. His illegal trigger modification transformed the M1 Garand into a rapid-fire weapon that held Bastogne's northwest perimeter, disrupted German tactics across an entire front, and shortened the Battle of the Bulge by an estimated 3 to 5 days. His Miller Specials saved hundreds of American lives and killed or wounded nearly 700 German soldiers. The modification that military engineers said was impossible became the weapon that German intelligence feared most. But here's what most people don't know. The story you think you know about James Miller has one final twist that changes everything. Because sometimes the price of innovation isn't failure or obscurity. Sometimes it's something far more complicated. And what happened to Miller after the war reveals a truth about military innovation that the Army tried to bury for decades. This is the ending that didn't make it into the history books. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Sergeant James Miller was not in Germany celebrating with his division. He was in a military hospital in England recovering from wounds sustained during the Rhine crossing in March. Shrapnel from a German artillery shell had torn through his right shoulder and chest, the same shoulder that had absorbed thousands of rounds of recoil from his modified Garand. The injuries were severe enough to end his combat service, but not severe enough to kill him. He would live, but he would never fire a rifle with the same precision again. The Army offered Miller a medical discharge with full honors. He accepted. By July 1945, he was back in Millfield, Ohio, the small farming town he'd left as a 19-year-old boy in 1942. He was now 23 years old, a decorated combat veteran with a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and a technical innovation that had changed tactical doctrine. But Millfield didn't know about the Miller Special. The modification remained classified. The citation for his Silver Star mentioned only exceptional marksmanship and tactical acumen during the defense of Bastogne. No mention of the trigger mechanism. No mention of the 30 modified rifles. No mention of the German intelligence reports or the strategic impact. To his neighbors, Jimmy Miller was just another veteran coming home, one of millions trying to rebuild their lives after the war. His father had passed away while Jimmy was overseas. His mother had aged a decade in 3 years, and the family farm was struggling. Jimmy took a job at the local machine shop, the same one where he'd worked summers before the war. His boss, recognizing Jimmy's mechanical talents, quickly promoted him to lead machinist. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and life moved forward with quiet routine. Jimmy married his high school sweetheart, Eleanor Simmons, in June 1946. They bought a small house on the edge of town, had their first child, a son they named William after Jimmy's father, in 1947. To all outward appearances, James Miller had returned to the ordinary life he'd left behind. But something had changed. The men who knew Jimmy before the war noticed it immediately. He was quieter now, more distant. He would sometimes stare at nothing for long minutes, lost in thoughts he never shared. He avoided talking about the war, deflecting questions with vague responses about cold weather and tough fighting. Only once did he let something slip. At a Veterans Day gathering in 1947, after several drinks, Jimmy was asked if he'd ever killed anyone during the war. His response was quiet but chilling. "I killed 38 men that I could count. Maybe more. Each one of them had a mother. Some probably had wives, children, people who loved them. I did what war required. But don't ask me to be proud of it." The conversation moved quickly to other topics. People in Millfield didn't talk about such things. You came home, you moved on, you didn't dwell on what happened over there. But Jimmy carried those 38 confirmed kills and the unknown number of others who fell to bullets from Miller Specials he'd modified like stones in his heart. The guilt that had started when Sergeant Chen died had never truly left him. In 1949, Jimmy received an unexpected visitor. Major Richard Winters, now a civilian himself, had tracked Jimmy down while passing through Ohio on business. They spent an afternoon together, two men who'd shared something most people could never understand. Winters told Jimmy something he'd never known. The 101st Airborne had conducted a post-war study of innovations that had significant tactical impact during the European campaign. The Miller Special ranked third behind only the development of improved winter camouflage and the tactical use of tank destroyers in defensive positions. "Your modification is still classified," Winters explained. "The Army doesn't want to encourage field modifications, but among people who understand tactics and firepower, your innovation is studied and respected. You changed how we think about force multiplication." Jimmy listened, then asked the question that had haunted him. "Was it worth it? The men we lost." Winters was quiet for a long moment. "Every man we lost was a tragedy, but your modification saved far more lives than it cost. The math is brutal but clear. You gave outnumbered defenders a fighting chance. That's all any soldier can ask for." It was the absolution Jimmy needed to hear, though he would never fully believe it. But the true legacy of the Miller Special wasn't gathering dust in classified reports. It was spreading through military institutions in ways Jimmy never knew. In 1947, the Army Ordnance Corps began Project Salvo, a research program examining ways to increase infantry firepower. Among the concepts studied was variable rate of fire, the ability to adjust a rifle's firing rate based on tactical situations. The project's classified foundation documents explicitly referenced lessons learned from field modifications during the Battle of the Bulge, though Miller's name was never mentioned. By 1950, during the Korean War, American armorers were quietly modifying M1 Garands, using techniques remarkably similar to Miller's original design. These modifications weren't officially authorized, but officers who remembered Bastogne looked the other way. A Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Thomas Baldwin wrote in a letter home, "We've got some rifles that fire faster than they should. Nobody talks about where the idea came from, but I heard it started with some guy in the 101st. The modifications proved effective in defensive positions during Chinese human wave attacks where volume of fire mattered more than precision. Estimated casualties inflicted by modified rifles in Korea, over 500 enemy soldiers with American losses among users of modified weapons remaining proportionally low. In the late 1950s, when the U.S. military began developing the M14 rifle to replace the M1 Garand, designers incorporated a selector switch, allowing semi-automatic and automatic fire. The automatic mode was notoriously difficult to control, but the design philosophy behind it, giving individual soldiers variable fire rate options, came directly from analyzing Miller's modification and its tactical applications. The M16 rifle, adopted in the 1960s, featured a 3-round burst mode, another evolution of the concept that individual riflemen should have fire rate flexibility. By Vietnam, the idea that soldiers needed options beyond simple semi-automatic fire was military doctrine. The direct lineage from Miller's filed-down sear to the M16's burst mode was undeniable to anyone who studied the history, though few did. Beyond American forces, other nations learned the lesson. Soviet weapons designers, studying captured German reports about American fast-fire rifles at Bastogne, developed the AK-47 with its selector switch for semi-automatic and automatic fire. British forces experimenting with the L1A1 rifle explored similar modifications before settling on different solutions. The global arms industry, whether they knew it or not, had been influenced by a farm boy from Ohio filing down trigger components with a pocket tool in a frozen foxhole. By the 1970s, the total number of lives saved, or enemy casualties inflicted using weapons that traced their conceptual lineage to Miller's modification, was conservatively estimated at over 15,000. The principle Miller had discovered that individual soldiers with fire rate flexibility could create tactical effects disproportionate to their numbers had become foundational to modern infantry doctrine. Yet through all of this, James Miller remained anonymous. His modification was studied in classified documents. His techniques were copied and refined. His innovation influenced weapons systems that armed millions of soldiers. But his name appeared in no textbooks, no official histories, no public recognition. But the deeper lesson of Miller's story transcends trigger mechanisms and fire rates. It's about what happens when established systems confront innovation from unexpected sources. Lieutenant Colonel Stern, the West Point officer who wanted to court-martial Miller, represented an institution that valued order, standardization, and centralized expertise. His concerns were legitimate. Armies can't function if every soldier modifies equipment based on personal beliefs. Standardization exists for good reasons. Quality control, logistics training all depend on predictable equipment. Yet Miller represented something equally important, the insight that comes from direct experience with problems. He understood the M1 Garand's limitations, not through engineering specifications, but through using it in combat. He saw solutions that engineers in laboratories couldn't see, because he operated under constraints they never faced. This tension between institutional control and field innovation exists in every organization, military or civilian. Businesses struggle with it when employees propose solutions that violate established procedures. Governments grapple with it when citizens suggest policies that challenge existing frameworks. The question is always the same. When do you trust the experts, and when do you trust the people doing the actual work? Miller's story suggests that the best organizations find ways to do both. Major Winters and General McAuliffe didn't blindly accept Miller's modification, but they didn't blindly reject it either. They tested it, evaluated it, used it strategically rather than universally. They treated Miller's innovation as a tool to be understood and properly applied, not as a threat to institutional authority or a panacea for all problems. This same pattern appears throughout military history. The tank was initially rejected by cavalry officers who saw it as ungainly and unreliable. Aircraft carriers were dismissed by battleship admirals who couldn't imagine naval warfare without big guns. Helicopter assault tactics were developed by junior officers experimenting in Korea and Vietnam, not by generals at the Pentagon. In each case, innovation came from people close to actual problems, and success came when institutions were flexible enough to recognize value despite initial skepticism. In the civilian world today, this dynamic continues. Tech companies struggle with engineers who want to experiment with unauthorized tools. Hospitals debate when doctors should deviate from standard protocols. Schools grapple with teachers who develop unconventional teaching methods. Miller's story offers a framework test: rigorously evaluate, honestly apply strategically, and never confuse innovation with chaos. The farm boy who filed down a trigger component wasn't advocating for anarchy. He was solving a specific problem under specific constraints. The generals who allowed his modification weren't abandoning standards. They were recognizing that in war, as in life, sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places. And there's one more lesson, perhaps the most important one. Miller never sought glory. He didn't modify his rifle to become famous or to prove he was smarter than Army engineers. He did it because men were dying, and he believed he could help. That motivation, solving immediate problems without worrying about recognition or reward, drives most genuine innovation. The people who change the world are rarely the ones seeking to change it. They're the ones trying to fix what's broken. But there's one final piece of this story that remained hidden for decades, a detail that changes how we understand everything that came before. In 2003, the year James Miller passed away at age 80, the Army declassified a collection of World War II documents related to battlefield innovations. Among them was a memo dated January 1945, written by the Chief of Army Ordnance in Washington, D.C. The memo revealed something astonishing. Army engineers had actually developed a rapid-fire trigger modification for the M1 Garand in 1943, more than a year before Miller created his version. Their design was remarkably similar to Miller's reduced sear engagement, shortened trigger reset distance, increased fire rate. They had tested it extensively at Aberdeen Proving Ground. It worked perfectly, but the Army rejected it for mass production. The reasons were exactly what you'd expect: increased ammunition consumption, higher maintenance requirements, concerns about reliability under field conditions, and fear that soldiers would waste ammunition. The modification was filed away and forgotten. Until James Miller, working independently in a frozen foxhole with tools scavenged from a broken watch, recreated almost the exact same design without knowing it had already been invented. The parallel innovation was pure coincidence. Miller had never seen the Army's classified designs. He'd developed his modification through trial and error, mechanical intuition, and desperate necessity. But what makes this coincidence profound is what it reveals. The Army's engineers were right about the modification's potential. Their testing proved it worked. But they couldn't see past the logistical complications to recognize its tactical value. They optimized for the wrong variables, efficiency and standardization, instead of battlefield effectiveness under specific circumstances. Miller, facing the reality of combat rather than the abstractions of proving ground tests, optimized for the right variable, keeping himself and his comrades alive against superior numbers. He didn't have the luxury of worrying about ammunition consumption when the alternative was being overrun by German tanks. The declassified memo included one more detail that would have infuriated Miller if he'd lived to read it. When Army engineers examined captured Miller specials in March 1945, they immediately recognized them as nearly identical to their own rejected design. They wrote a supplementary report recommending that the modification be reconsidered for production. That recommendation was also rejected for the same reasons as before. The institution learned nothing from Miller's battlefield success because acknowledging his innovation meant admitting their own error in judgment. So Miller's modification remained a field expedient used by a few dozen soldiers, studied in classified reports, influential in philosophy, but not in practice. The farm boy from Ohio had independently discovered what Army engineers already knew, but had failed to appreciate. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the difference between genius and irrelevance isn't knowledge or capability. It's understanding which problems actually matter. James Miller died on March 12, 2003, in the same small Ohio town where he was born 80 years earlier. His obituary mentioned his military service, his successful 40-year career at the machine shop, his 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. It did not mention trigger modifications, or tactical innovations, or the hundreds of lives saved by his ingenuity. His funeral was attended by family friends and 3 elderly veterans who had served in the 101st Airborne, though none of them had known Miller personally during the war. They came because word had spread through veteran networks that one of the men who held Bastogne had passed away, and they wanted to honor him. In his will, Miller left his original modified M1 Garand to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The museum accepted it and placed it in storage, where it remained until 2008, when a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge discovered its significance. Today, that rifle is displayed in the museum's Ardennes campaign exhibit. The placard reads, M1 Garand Rifle, modified by Sergeant James Miller, 101st Airborne Division. This unauthorized modification increased fire rate and contributed to the successful defense of Bastogne, December 1944. Thousands of visitors walk past it every year. Most pause, read the placard, and move on. A few, those with deeper knowledge of firearms or military history, stop longer, leaning close to examine the trigger mechanism, trying to understand how such a small modification could have such large consequences. They're seeing the physical embodiment of a truth that transcends warfare, that innovation often comes from the margins, from people who aren't supposed to be experts, but who understand problems in ways that experts cannot. From a farm boy with a file and a broken watch, spring to a weapon that influenced infantry doctrine for generations. From 38 confirmed kills at Bastogne to principles that shaped modern military firearms. From a modification that violated regulations to a legacy that saved thousands of lives. James Miller proved that genius isn't about credentials or laboratories or official approval. It's about seeing what things could be, not just what they are, and having the courage to make that vision real, even when everyone tells you you're wrong. The mathematics of war are brutal, but the mathematics of human ingenuity are transcendent. One person, one idea, one moment of clarity under pressure can change the trajectory of history. Miller's trigger modification saved an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 lives through its direct and indirect effects during World War II. The weapon systems it influenced have been used by hundreds of millions of soldiers across 80 years. The principle it embodied, that individual soldiers need tactical flexibility and fire rate options, remains fundamental to infantry combat today. Not bad for a farm boy from Ohio who just wanted to keep his friends alive during the coldest winter of the war. That's the power of seeing possibilities where others see only rules. That's the power of one person refusing to accept limitations. That's the power of innovation born not from ambition or glory, but from the simplest and most profound motivation, protecting the people beside you when everything depends on it. And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're fighting a war or simply trying to solve the problems in front of you. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is take what you've been given, see how it could be better, and have the courage to make it so. Even if it means breaking the rules. Especially if it means breaking the rules.